Every year, thousands of people make the same 30-year financial decision based on a single number they saw in a listing, and most of them never revisit that decision once the paperwork is signed. Today, we are going to walk through exactly what happens after the signature dries, using two men, one decision, and 30 years of real numbers. This is not a debate. This is a breakdown. We are going to examine the bank statements, the receipts, the appreciation records, and the quiet compounding that happened while nobody was watching. By the end, we will know exactly which decision built wealth, which one slowly drained it, and more importantly, why the answer is not as simple as either side wants you to believe. Most financial content treats this decision like it has one obvious right answer. Real financial outcomes rarely work that cleanly. They unfold slowly, in small increments that are almost invisible in any single year, and only become obvious once you line up 3 decades of numbers side by side. The subjects: Jim, who chose to rent; Michael, who chose to buy. Same starting income, same city, same savings account balance on the day the decision was made. What happened to their money over the next 3 decades is the whole story. Part 2. The starting point. Both men were 30 years old. Both earned $60,000 a year. Both had $65,000 sitting in savings, money they had spent years accumulating through the usual combination of discipline, luck, and skipping vacations. They now pretend they never wanted anyway. Michael found a house he liked, a modest $280,000 property in a quiet neighborhood, and decided this was the year he stopped renting. He put $56,000 down, just under 20%, and financed the rest with a 30-year mortgage at 6% interest. His monthly principal and interest payment came out to about $1,340. Add property taxes near $200 a month and insurance around $100, and Michael's baseline monthly housing cost settled at roughly $1,640, with maintenance still waiting quietly in the wings. Jim looked at the same market, ran a few numbers in his head, decided homeownership felt like signing up for 30 years of unpredictable expenses, and renewed his lease instead. His comparable apartment cost $1,250 a month. He took his $65,000 and placed it into a broad market index fund, historically averaging around 8% a year. On day one, Jim's monthly outflow was smaller, his cash was still liquid, and his money was already working for him in the market instead of sitting in a down payment. Here is the monthly expense sheet for both men in year one, laid out side by side. Michael's monthly costs: $1,340 in mortgage principal and interest, $195 in property taxes, $95 in homeowner's insurance, and an estimated $150 set aside for future maintenance. Total monthly cost of ownership, approximately $1,780. Jim's monthly costs, $1,250 in rent, and $18 for a renter's insurance policy covering his personal belongings. Total monthly cost of renting, approximately $1,268. On this single line item, Jim is ahead by roughly $512 every month, money that either sits in his checking account or flows directly into his index fund. Part 3. The first 3 years. The first 3 years look like a clear win for Jim. His rent stays flat during the initial lease term. His portfolio compounds without him lifting a finger. And by the end of year 3, his $65,000 has grown to approximately $81,900. He has paid $0 in maintenance, $0 in property taxes, and exactly 1 repair-related phone call, which he made to his landlord about a flickering hallway light that was not even inside his own unit. Michael's numbers tell a very different story in these early years. Closing costs took roughly $8,400 out of his pocket before he even moved in. A combination of lender fees, title insurance, and inspection costs that nobody warned him about in detail until the paperwork was already in front of him. Then came the quiet, brutal math of early mortgage amortization. In year 1, of the roughly $16,080 he paid toward his mortgage, nearly $13,800 went straight to interest. Only around $2,280 actually reduced what he owed the bank. He also spent about $2,200 in year 2 replacing a water heater and patching a small section of fence damaged in a storm, expenses that simply do not exist on Jim's side of the ledger. At the 3-year mark, judging on cash flow alone, Jim is clearly ahead, and the story would look finished if we stopped reading here. Part 4. 4 moments. The ownership side rarely shows you. Incidents that never touch Jim's bank account, but hit Michael's every single time. Moment 1. Year 2. A Tuesday night. Michael's water heater stops producing hot water. He calls a plumber, waits 2 days for an appointment, and pays $650 to replace it. Across town, in Jim's building, the exact same appliance fails in a neighboring unit. The tenant sends one text message to the property manager. A technician arrives the next morning. The tenant pays nothing. Same appliance, same failure, two completely different outcomes. Year 5, the middle of summer. Michael's air conditioning unit dies during a heat wave. The repair technician quotes him $480 for a same-day fix, and he pays it immediately because waiting is not really an option at 95 degrees. Jim's air conditioning, provided and maintained by his landlord under the terms of his lease, also struggles that same week. One phone call later, and Jim's only cost is mild inconvenience for an afternoon. Year 8. After a heavy storm season, Michael discovers a section of his roof has started leaking into the attic. The full repair runs him $3,100. Money that comes directly out of savings he had earmarked for something else entirely. Jim's roof, part of a building he does not own a single shingle of, develops a similar issue after the same storm. The landlord hires a contractor, absorbs the cost, and Jim finds out about the whole situation only because he noticed a ladder outside his window for an afternoon. Year 14. An ordinary Wednesday, Michael's dishwasher finally gives out after years of service. He shops for a replacement, pays for delivery and installation, and spends about $720 total. Jim's dishwasher fails the same year. He mentions it to his landlord, and within the week a new one is installed, at no cost to him whatsoever, because the appliance was never his responsibility to maintain in the first place. None of these 4 incidents show up anywhere in a mortgage calculator or a rent comparison chart, yet they represent a real and recurring category of expense that only exists on one side of this comparison. Over 30 years, incidents like these do not happen 4 times. They happen dozens of times, in different forms, at unpredictable moments, and they are entirely Michael's problem to solve, and entirely Jim's problem to simply report to somebody else. Part 5, where the math quietly flips. But this comparison is rarely settled in the first 3 years, and anyone who stops here has stopped too early. Around year 4, the picture starts to change, quietly, in the kind of small increments nobody flags as significant until they are reviewed years later in a single sitting. Jim's lease renews, and his rent increases by 4%, a jump of about $50 a month. It is not alarming on its own. The following year, another increase, then another. None of these increases individually look like a threat, which is exactly the problem with a cost that accumulates slowly. By year 10, Jim's rent has climbed from $1,250 to approximately $1,675 a month, a quiet compounding of its own, except this compounding works against him instead of for him, silently reducing how much of his paycheck is actually available to invest each month. Michael's mortgage payment, meanwhile, remains exactly $1,340, unchanged since the day he signed. In year 1, that number felt inconvenient next to Jim's lower rent. By year 10, it no longer looks inconvenient at all, because Jim is now paying more in rent alone than Michael pays for his entire mortgage payment. The appreciation records tell an even bigger part of the story. Michael's $280,000 home, growing at a historically typical 3.5% per year, is worth approximately $395,000 by year 10. His mortgage balance has meanwhile dropped to around $209,000. That leaves him with roughly $186,000 in equity, built from a $56,000 down payment. This is the detail most casual observers miss entirely. Michael is earning appreciation on the full value of the house, not just on the money he originally put in. His $56,000 is effectively controlling and growing alongside an asset worth 5 times that amount. Jim's portfolio, growing on its own without leverage, has reached approximately $140,000 by year 10, a genuinely strong result for a hands-off investment. But the gap between the two men has narrowed considerably, and the direction of travel favors Michael from this point forward. Here is the monthly expense sheet again, this time at year 10. Michael's costs: $1,340 in mortgage principal and interest, unchanged. $265 in property taxes, which have grown along with the home's rising assessed value, $120 in insurance, and a maintenance reserve now closer to $200 a month once actual repair history is averaged in. Total monthly cost, approximately $1,925. Jim's costs: $1,675 in rent, and $22 in renter's insurance. Total monthly cost, approximately $1,697. Jim is still paying less every month at this point, roughly $228 less, but the gap that once favored him by over $500 a month has shrunk by more than half, and it keeps shrinking every year after this one. Part 6. The long-term pattern. By year 20, the pattern that began quietly in year 4 has become impossible to ignore. Michael's home is worth somewhere between $550,000 and $580,000. His mortgage balance has fallen to roughly $120,000, leaving him with approximately $430,000 to $460,000 in equity. His monthly payment is still $1,340, the same number it has always been, while everything else around him has become more expensive. Jim's rent has climbed to approximately $2,250 a month by year 20. His portfolio has grown to roughly $310,000, assuming he continued adding modest monthly contributions on top of the original lump sum, which is a generous assumption that not every investor actually follows through on for 2 decades straight. The monthly expense sheet at year 20 tells the rest of the story. Michael's costs, $1,340 in mortgage principal and interest, still unchanged, $340 in property taxes, $155 in insurance, and a maintenance reserve of about $240 a month. Total monthly cost, approximately $2,075. Jim's costs, $2,250 in rent and $29 in renter's insurance. Total monthly cost, approximately $2,279. For the first time in this comparison, Jim's monthly cost has actually overtaken Michael's, and Michael is building equity with every payment while Jim is not. By year 30, Michael's mortgage is fully paid off. He owns a home worth somewhere between $780,000 and $820,000 outright, and his monthly housing cost drops to taxes, insurance, and maintenance, somewhere around $550 a month. Jim, in year 30, is paying rent of approximately $3,000 a month, plus renter's insurance near $35, bringing his total monthly cost to roughly $3,035, with no end date, no final payment, and no asset waiting for him at the finish line, only a lease renewal notice arriving like clockwork every 12 months. At this point, Jim's monthly housing cost is more than 5 times what Michael pays. Part 7. The full pros and cons. A fair comparison weighs both sides. The upside of renting: lower upfront cost, keeping savings liquid, no maintenance obligations, so a failing water heater is never your bill, freedom to relocate without the cost of selling a property, no exposure to a declining housing market, and peace of mind from never worrying about a roof. The downside of renting: your cost is not fixed and tends to rise every year. You build zero equity, you have limited control, since a landlord can sell, decline to renew, or raise costs. And there is no finish line, so payments continue for as long as you need a place to live, often into retirement. The upside of buying: a fixed payment inflation gradually makes easier to manage. The benefit of leverage: earning appreciation on the full property value, not just the down payment. Forced equity building with every payment, and an actual finish line, a date when the mortgage disappears. The downside of buying: substantial closing costs up front, unpredictable maintenance expenses, rising property taxes even when your mortgage does not rise, illiquid equity you cannot easily access without selling or borrowing, and real risk if you move within just a few years, since transaction costs can erase any gains. Part 8. When the answer changes. There is no single answer for every situation. If you may move within 3 to 5 years, the numbers tilt toward renting, since closing and selling costs consume early equity. If your market has an inflated price-to-rent ratio, buying may not make sense regardless of the mortgage rate. And if you have the discipline to invest the difference every month for decades, renting and investing can rival or exceed buying. If you plan to stay 7 years or longer, if your price-to-rent ratio favors ownership, or if your rent already sits close to a mortgage payment, the numbers tilt toward buying, and continuing to rent often means quietly losing ground. Part 9. The real takeaway. Jim and Michael both made a reasonable decision with what they knew. Jim was not foolish for renting, and Michael was not automatically wise for buying. What separated their outcomes was not the initial decision, but what each choice quietly did in the background. Michael benefited from a fixed cost in a world of rising prices, and from leverage that let a modest down payment grow alongside a larger asset. Jim benefited from liquidity, flexibility, and never worrying about a roof or a dying dishwasher. The real takeaway is not that buying wins or renting loses. It is that almost nobody runs their own numbers before a decision this size, and the gap was visible from year one to anyone willing to look. Before you decide, calculate your local price to rent ratio, price out your true monthly cost of ownership, and be honest about whether you would actually invest the difference for decades. That answer, worked out from your own numbers, is the only one that should decide your next move.